The streets of America have never seen anything like it. Imagine waking up to the roar of engines outside your window, only to find Abrams tanks grinding down your boulevard, armored vehicles parked at intersections, and squads of soldiers moving between homes and storefronts with rifles at the ready. Helicopters circle overhead, while drones sweep across neighborhoods, mapping every corner as if the suburbs themselves were a battlefield. This is not a scene from a foreign war zone. It is the vision Donald Trump has unleashed. Large-scale urban war games, practiced not in deserts or mock villages, but in the living heart of American cities. The announcement sent shockwaves across the country. Supporters called it bold preparation for the wars of tomorrow, an essential step if U.S. forces are to face enemies in cities like Kyiv, Taipei, or Tehran. Critics saw something darker, a dangerous blurring of the line between military readiness and domestic intimidation. What other purpose could there be in bringing tanks and troops into quiet neighborhoods, if not to remind Americans of the power that stands behind Trump's return to the political stage? For the Pentagon, the logic is clear. The wars of the 21st century are urban. From Fallujah to Mariupol, from Mosul to Gaza, battles have shifted into dense, crowded environments where tanks become coffins and every street is a trap. Future wars, they argue, will not be won in empty deserts or rolling plains. They will be decided in city blocks and apartment towers, with civilians all around. But to critics, using real American towns as training grounds risks something irreversible: the normalization of military force on U.S. soil. And so the nation finds itself staring at an image it never thought possible: its own armed forces rehearsing for war in the streets where children play and families shop. The question is no longer just about strategy abroad. It is about the very soul of the country. Where are you watching this from right now? Tell us, because this is not just another headline. This is a glimpse into a future where the line between democracy and militarization grows dangerously thin. And if you want to follow how this story unfolds, stay with us, because what begins with war games could end in something far more real. Donald Trump's declaration landed like a thunderclap. In a rally speech carried live on national television, he described a vision of American strength unlike anything seen since the height of the Cold War. His words were deliberate, his tone commanding. The U.S. military would no longer limit its training to isolated ranges in the desert or controlled facilities on distant bases. Instead, soldiers, tanks, armored vehicles, and drones would take to the streets of America's own cities for full-scale urban warfare exercises. The justification, according to Trump, was simple. He argued that America's enemies were preparing for war in cities, not in open fields. If U.S. troops were ever to retake Kyiv from Russian forces, hold the streets of Taipei against a Chinese assault, or dismantle terror networks hidden in crowded Middle Eastern neighborhoods, they needed to practice in environments that looked and felt real. "You don't win tomorrow's wars," Trump thundered, "by playing games in deserts. You win them by knowing how to fight where the people live." The immediate reaction was explosive. Supporters erupted with applause, calling the idea brilliant and overdue. They saw it as Trump's signature style: bold, unconventional, and unapologetically focused on dominance. Right-wing commentators hailed the proposal as a return to strength, a sign that America would no longer be caught unprepared in the face of adversaries. But critics were horrified. Civil liberties groups condemned the plan as reckless, warning that rolling tanks through U.S. neighborhoods blurred the sacred boundary between military power and civilian life. Mayors from across the political spectrum voiced alarm at the thought of soldiers drilling in residential areas, fearing damage, chaos, and intimidation. Some governors vowed to block National Guard units from participating if federal orders came. Inside the Pentagon, The response was more complicated. Privately, many generals admitted Trump had touched a nerve. The future of warfare is indeed urban, and current training facilities cannot replicate the chaos of real cities: dense buildings, tight streets, unpredictable environments. Yet, even they worried about optics. America, unlike authoritarian states, has always prided itself on keeping the military separate from the civilian sphere. To practice war in the very streets where citizens live was to cross a line many believed should never be touched. The media storm only added fuel. Networks broadcast simulations of tanks on Main Street, graphics showing soldiers patrolling suburban neighborhoods, and anchors asking whether America was witnessing preparation for war abroad, or for something much closer to home. The debate was no longer confined to military necessity. It had become political theater, a battle for the nation's conscience. For the generals who quietly supported Trump's proposal, the reasoning was rooted in hard lessons written in blood. Modern battlefields are no longer the vast deserts of the Gulf War or the jungles of Vietnam. They are the shattered streets of Fallujah, the rubble of Aleppo, the scorched remains of Mosul, and the devastated neighborhoods of Mariupol. These places revealed a brutal truth. The wars of the 21st century are urban, and they are unforgiving. In Fallujah, U.S. Marines fought block by block, facing ambushes from doorways and rooftops. Every alley became a kill zone, every building a fortress. Armored vehicles that once rolled confidently through open terrain found themselves trapped in tight streets, easy prey for cheap roadside bombs. The cost in lives was staggering. In Mosul, Iraqi and American-backed forces confronted a nightmare of tunnels, booby traps, and house-to-house combat that stretched on for months. Thousands of civilians were caught in the middle, their presence complicating every strike and every advance. And in Ukraine, the lesson has only sharpened. The ruins of Mariupol stand as a symbol of how cities can swallow entire armies. Russia and Ukraine alike have thrown men and machines into these battles, where tanks are destroyed at close range by handheld weapons and drones stalk soldiers through collapsed apartment blocks. For both sides, the urban battlefield has proven to be the great equalizer, a place where high technology and overwhelming firepower can be neutralized by the density and chaos of the city. This is why American commanders whisper that the old training grounds are obsolete. A desert base in Nevada cannot mimic the chaos of an apartment tower filled with civilians. A mock village on a military range cannot recreate the complexity of a modern city grid. If the next war is in Taipei, with skyscrapers, highways, and millions of people under fire, or in the streets of Eastern Europe, where Soviet-era housing blocks dominate the landscape, the U.S. military must be prepared. Trump's proposal, then, was framed not just as a show of force, but as a grim necessity. To win tomorrow's wars, troops must practice today in environments that feel authentic. But to his critics, that logic sounded like a thin veil. Was this really about preparing soldiers for Taiwan? Or was it about conditioning Americans to accept tanks in their own streets? Was it readiness or rehearsal for control? The debate cut deep because both realities could be true, and the vision of armored columns moving through American neighborhoods carried with it an unease that no amount of military logic could erase. The political firestorm erupted within hours of Trump's announcement. What he had framed as bold preparation for the wars of tomorrow was seized upon by his opponents as something far more sinister. Critics claimed it was less about readiness abroad and more about power at home. Civil rights groups immediately sounded alarms, warning that armored vehicles in U.S. neighborhoods carried echoes of authoritarian regimes. They drew chilling comparisons to Tiananmen Square, to Soviet crackdowns in Budapest and Prague, to any moment in history when governments turned military strength inward. Their message was simple. America does not train for war in its own streets, because once the line is crossed, it cannot be uncrossed. Governors in several states declared they would resist federal orders. "We will not allow our cities to become training grounds for political theater," one declared at a press conference. Mayors worried about chaos, damage to infrastructure, and the effect on residents suddenly confronted with live military exercises outside their homes. Even some within Trump's own party hesitated, fearing the optics of tanks in suburbia would alienate independent voters already wary of creeping authoritarianism. But Trump's supporters doubled down. They argued the opposition was hysterical, blind to the realities of modern warfare. Fox News commentators praised the plan as visionary, insisting that soldiers who practiced in real neighborhoods would be sharper, faster, and more prepared to fight in Kyiv, in Tehran, or in the looming conflict over Taiwan. They accused critics of weakness, of caring more about appearances than survival. "This is what strength looks like," one host declared. "If our enemies aren't afraid, we've already lost." Inside the Pentagon, the reaction was divided. Some senior officers quietly welcomed the push. Privately, they admitted their training was inadequate for urban war, but others were deeply uneasy. The U.S. military has always maintained a careful wall between civilian society and military operations. To breach that wall, even in the name of preparation, risked damaging the very democracy it claimed to defend. For ordinary Americans, the announcement felt like a thunderclap of uncertainty. Social media filled with photoshopped images of tanks outside Walmarts, of soldiers patrolling suburban cul-de-sacs, of helicopters buzzing over city halls. Some people laughed, treating it as absurd political theater. Others saw it as a warning, a glimpse of a darker future in which military force becomes a tool of domestic control. The debate spiraled beyond strategy and into identity. Was America still the nation that kept its soldiers overseas and its cities free of armored columns? Or was it now drifting toward a new normal, where military spectacle on home soil was just another expression of power? And at the center of the storm stood Trump himself, confident, unyielding, and perfectly aware that his idea had achieved exactly what he intended. It had divided the nation, dominated the headlines, and forced everyone to imagine a future where war and home were no longer separate places. Abroad, the announcement landed like a seismic shock. In Beijing, state media seized on Trump's words, spinning them as proof that America was preparing for war not only overseas, but on its own streets. Commentators on Chinese television suggested that the United States was bracing for internal collapse, practicing for civil unrest disguised as military readiness. "The empire is training to fight its own people," one anchor declared, echoing a message crafted for both domestic reassurance and international propaganda. In Moscow, the Kremlin's mouthpieces went even further. Russian generals, already locked in grinding combat in Ukraine, welcomed the narrative as validation of their claims that America was a destabilizing power. On Russian state TV, grainy footage of U.S. tanks in American suburbs played alongside commentary warning that Washington was preparing to unleash military power against any opposition, foreign or domestic. The irony was not lost on viewers. Russia's own troops were demolishing Ukrainian cities, yet it was America now accused of militarizing its streets. In Tehran, the reaction was more calculating. Iranian officials pointed to Trump's proposal as evidence that the U.S. was overstretched, torn between foreign ambitions and domestic fragility. Analysts suggested that a military that rehearses urban war in its own neighborhoods reveals a quiet fear of unrest at home, a weakness adversaries could exploit. "A giant trembling inside its own borders," one editorial wrote. But beyond propaganda, there were serious military implications. Strategists in Beijing and Moscow understood what Trump was trying to achieve. They, too, knew that the wars of the future will be fought in cities. They recognized the advantage of soldiers trained in realistic, complex urban environments. And they worried, because if America could break its own taboos and begin such training, it might regain a hard edge lost after years of counterinsurgency campaigns. Yet, there was another risk, one that allies noticed with unease. European partners wondered aloud whether Trump's war games were preparation for foreign battlefields or a sign of growing instability at home. NATO capitals were split. Some saw the logic. Urban training is essential, and America had the resources to do it better than anyone else. Others worried it sent the wrong message, portraying the U.S. not as the leader of the free world, but as a nation sliding into militarized politics. The paradox was stark. To Trump's supporters, urban war games in American cities would project strength. To adversaries, it could be spun as weakness. And to allies, it raised the most uncomfortable question of all. Was America preparing for war abroad, or bracing for something more dangerous within? The world was watching, and the sight of tanks in U.S. neighborhoods would not be forgotten. Whether it was seen as bold preparation or chilling overreach, one truth became clear. America's decisions at home now carried consequences on every battlefield abroad. The image lingers like a nightmare you can't shake. Tanks grinding down quiet streets, soldiers in full combat gear moving past schools and churches, helicopters thundering overhead while drones scan the rooftops of American homes. What was once unthinkable has now been spoken into existence. Trump has promised urban war games on U.S. soil, and whether it happens tomorrow or months from now, the country has already been forced to imagine it. To some, it is a vision of strength, an America unafraid to prepare for the wars it must fight abroad, ready to face Beijing's ambitions or Moscow's aggression in the same unforgiving urban landscapes where battles are now decided. To others, it is a glimpse of something far darker, a future where the military's presence in everyday life is normalized, where the boundary between civilian and soldier dissolves, and where political power is reinforced not just at the ballot box, but by the silent pressure of armored steel on asphalt. The debate is no longer about whether urban training is necessary. History has already decided that cities are the battlegrounds of the 21st century. The real question is whether America can train for that reality without sacrificing the principles that have defined it for generations. Because once tanks roll through neighborhoods, even for practice, the line between democracy and militarization blurs, and blurred lines are easily crossed. As allies watch with unease and adversaries spread propaganda, the stakes are no longer just tactical, they are existential. A nation that begins to rehearse war in its own streets is a nation forced to answer a haunting question: who is the enemy we are preparing to fight? And so America stands at a crossroads, staring into a future where the sound of engines and the shadow of steel may mark more than preparation for foreign wars. They may be the warning drums of something waiting within.